Welcome, everybody, to Legends and Lectures. We're back with a very special guest who has been here before and is returning. And I asked him to return because he has an absolutely fantastic book that I can't wait to talk about. Dr. Francis Young, hooray! Thank you for being back here again.
It's lovely to be back.
I mean, last time we talked about the paganism, but this time we're talking about the fairies. And this is your third fairy book. So, why the keen interest in the fairies? Because this book is called Fairies: A History. And so, is it really a history? And why the third book?
Well, I would maintain that it really is a history. Fairies are not a subject which often gets proper historical attention. We see a lot of books when it comes to fairy lore, which are encyclopedias of fairies, trying to categorize them. We get books which are about fairies from a clairvoyant perspective, where people have been writing about their own claimed fairy experiences. We get books which are folkloric, that are sort of collecting narratives and stories about fairies. But what I'm trying to do in Fairies: A History is approach fairies as a historical phenomenon, or more precisely, to approach the human experience of encountering fairies as a historical phenomenon. So the real focus of the book is on human encounters with fairies, human ideas about fairyland, so sort of theories, rationalizations, attempts to make sense of what the fairies are and what their world is. The emphasis is less on representations of fairies in art or in literature. That's something which has been done before by people like Diane Purkis, who's done brilliant work on that. So I'm steering clear of that, and I'm more focusing on this question of experience and theorization, how people have tried to explain it.
So, you open up your book with a quote from my good buddy Gerald of Wales, famous Imaginist who made up a lot of stuff, like Irish werewolves, which I love. But you say you specifically take the quote where it says, "If, however, the scrupulous inquirer should ask me what I feel about the truth of this tale, I reply with Augustine that the wondrous things of God are to be marveled at, not debated with disputation, and I do not." By denying it, place limits on divine power, but nor do I, by affirming it, insolently stretch what cannot be stretched. So why this quote in relation to fairies?
I think it captures something of the ambiguity of fairies within the European cultural tradition. The one thing that all European fairy traditions have got in common, more or less, is that they have coexisted for a long time with Christianity. And they exist within societies where people are making accommodations within their Christianity for popular beliefs. And that's true of 12th century Wales
Hmm.
that Gerald is talking about, as well as Romania or Spain, or wherever you might choose to mention in Europe. And what we find is throughout history an ambivalence towards fairies from the point of view of Christian beliefs. So, on the one hand, you will sometimes get people who want to accommodate fairies within their cosmology because they're fairly sure that they exist and people are reporting experiences of them, like the experience of the priest Elidir, which gives rise to Gerald's reflections on fairies. This Welsh priest who, as a boy, finds himself on a riverbank all alone and gains access into this world of diminutive people, but eventually is banished and exiled from that world. But on the other hand, you get people who are always keen to say, no, fairies have no place within Christian cosmology. There's angels, there's demons, there's heaven, there's hell, there's a duality, and therefore the fairies must be demons because they're clearly not angels.
Hmm.
So, this is all deception. This is all, to be avoided at all costs. And that ambivalence is always there. And I think also what, Gerald's quotation sums up is that tension between, on the one hand, giving credence to things that have been reported for centuries, which medieval people were generally pretty open to anecdote and reportage. But on the other hand, a kind of a desire to avoid what they might have called vain superstition. So, believing things that have no ground in scripture or in the teachings of the church, which, fairies clearly stand beyond that. So yeah, there's always this huge ambivalence, and the book really is an attempt to try and untangle that ambivalence.
So we talked a little bit about fairies and where they fit in our world or where they fit in the past. But what exactly are fairies? Are they godlings? Are they small gods? And in your book, you say it is no accident that no single agreed way of talking about this. So, what exactly is a fairy?
Yeah, it's a really hard question. And there will be some people who look at this book or read this book and they say, what a load of nonsense. You can't lump together all these supernatural beings from different cultures as fairies. But the fact that we have this tendency to use the word fairy, which comes from a particular historical context in Britain, in the late Middle Ages, under the influence of Norman French, the fact that we use this word at all suggests that some kind of verbal and lexical convergence has taken place, even if there's not a conceptual convergence. So there is now kind of no other word that we can use. So we've ended up in this rather awkward bind. There is no word, there is no neutral word which is acceptable to all cultures, which is used across, borders to refer to these intermediate morally ambivalent beings, which isn't fairies. And so it just so happens that the nature of the globalization of this concept and the globalization of fairy lore means that this British idea of the fairy has been uppermost. And I think, J.M. Barrie's Peter Pan has got a lot to answer for in that regard. Other cultural milestones like the Cottingley fairies and,
Mhm.
Disney's use of fairies and so forth. So we've ended up with this kind of international fairy who would be recognized, even if you go to Japan, for example, the international fairy would be well recognized in East Asia. And this is this sort of tiny, feminine, winged, insect-like size being, the SWF, or the small winged fairy, as my colleague Simon Young describes it. And the small winged fairy has kind of become the usual reference. So if you go into a bookshop, look for, children's coloring book about fairies, it will probably be these small winged fairies. Now, that doesn't bear much relation to the British tradition of fairies, let alone other traditions of fairies throughout the world. So essentially, the kind of beings that we're looking for are social supernatural beings. So they are supernatural. They are definitively non-human. That's a very important characteristic of fairies. They are not like ghosts. It's not that they used to be human and now are not. They're not like witches in that they're humans with special powers. They are non-human entities, but they are also physical. They are corporeal. So in that respect, they're unlike angels. They're unlike ghosts. They have this physicality, and often they will engage in human physical behaviors. They will eat. They will have relationships. They will give birth to children. They have this. They'll fight wars even. So they have this physicality to them, but they can pop in and out of our ability to see them, so they can become invisible. That seems to be a very common, if not universal, characteristic of these beings. And they are morally ambivalent. They cannot be said to be good in an unqualified way. They cannot be said to be wholly bad. They have their own rules, which they adhere to fairly strictly. So they are sometimes arbiters of quite strict and brutal justice. They have a strongly developed sense of justice. But having said that, you then have to ask yourself, which beings are we going to include in this category? Take, for example, Scandinavia's trolls. Are trolls fairies? Now, I would say that they are, even though they are usually very, very ugly, compared to fairies in the British or Irish tradition, for example, and probably a bit more malign, although not wholly malign. So again, I would say that they are fairies in that respect. And fairies also are usually, though not always, associated with enchantment in some way, and the trolls are certainly associated with enchantment. So my broad argument is that fairies is a concept which, while unsatisfactory and inadequate, it can be extended in a plausible way to the totality of Europe. And then moving beyond Europe to those areas that have come under European cultural and colonial influence, we can extend it to areas like the Americas, and even beyond the Americas, some places like the Philippines, for example, where you've got a heavy Iberian cultural influence. That we can say, and Australia as well, Australia and New Zealand, we can say that there is a global spread of this belief. But what I'm not prepared to do, and I think it would take a much deeper writer than I, and probably an anthropologist rather than a historian, would be to look at the totality of all traditions of intermediate spirit beings, social supernatural spirit beings, across all cultures in all places. Because you find this stuff in African cultures, in Japanese culture, in East Asian cultures, all over the place. And so the only cases in which I've written about that as a tangent is where there's some kind of colonial interaction with European fairy beliefs that have been imported. So it's not truly a global history, but it's as close as I could get within the constraints of my training as a historian and a folklorist to a global history of fairies.
Yeah, the word yokai just came into the OED. And I think so now if we want to, because you said we might not have another word, it's true. How do you describe a fairy to somebody who doesn't know what it is, or somebody who comes from a different culture? And I think yokai is pretty close,
Yeah,
but because they are supernatural beings, they run by their own rules. There are new ones that are made all the time. Sometimes they're good, sometimes they're bad. You can leave them cucumbers if you're talking about kappa, and maybe they'll do a little favor for you, or sometimes they'll drown you. That's just how it is. So I think now that we have the
yes.
word yokai, I think that's pretty close. But then, as you said, we have the Irish Aishi, where you go what they don't have wings. They're just people who have a court. Okay, well that kind of works. What about elves? What about dwarves? What about, as you said, what about gnomes, trolls? I think any kind of unexplained supernatural being that lives by its own, I think we could definitely call that a fairy. But where you touched upon this a little bit, but where does that word fairy or even fae, where does that word come from?
Yeah, this is something which I explored in my earlier book, Twilight of the Godlings, which was a specific focus on British fairy belief and an attempt to get to its origins. Because clearly, if you're going to explore what fairies are on a European scale or a global scale, you have to begin with this word that comes from Britain, or at least in its form that we have it, it comes from Britain. And fairy is very complex, in terms of its origins. It is quite mysterious in some respects. Essentially, what you find in round about the 12th century in romances, and so these vernacular stories that are being written down in northern France mainly, but are heavily influenced by Breton oral tradition, which of course is of a Celtic origin. We come up with this concept of féerie. Féerie is enchantment, is what it means, or a state of enchantment, or a place of enchantment by extension. It's not a particular kind of being. Now, when those vernacular romances cross the channel, what we end up with is the English picking out from that word féerie, oh, the beings who are bearers of enchantment in the medieval romances, like Morgan Le Fay,
Hmm.
she must be a fae, that is to say, a singular, which is kind of retconned from féerie. She is a fae, and the French do the same, and they have the word fae. And so we end up with the fae coming out of féerie, but féerie comes first. Then you might ask, how does Fae become fairy as a being? And that's really just pure confusion. So people become confused between fairy and fae, and they start referring to the fae, that is to say, the individual being who is a fairy, as a fairy, when in fact fairy is the name of the land or the state of enchantment or whatever. But then you might ask, where did this word fairy originally come from anyway? And it's from the Latin fata or fatata. Fatata means somebody who is enchanted. In other words, their fate has been somehow determined, or they are under the influence of the fates. And so, tracing this back really into the distant past, into classical antiquity, it goes back to the Fates, otherwise known as the Parcae in Roman tradition, or the Moirai in Greek tradition, who are the three women, mythological women, who spin the fates of human beings as a thread. And of course, one of them is there at the end with the clippers to cut that thread of fate and end your life. And it seems that, well, my own theory, which is based on what I wrote in Twilight of the Godlings, is that the Parcae were suppressed by the church at the time of Christianization, round about the fourth century. So people start to refer to the Parcae in a kind of indirect way. So that the euphemism that they use is the speech of the Parcae, the fatae, the spoken things in Latin, fata, spoken utterances. And then those spoken utterances then become personified like the Parcae were, even though the Parcae themselves have been forgotten. And so you go through this sort of black box that we don't fully understand, but sometime in late antiquity, the early Middle Ages, the Parcae are transformed into the Fates. And eventually that feeds into that medieval Romance tradition. So yeah, obviously that word fairy becomes applied by English colonists in Ireland to the ice sheet. But of course, there's not necessarily any real connection there at all. And so you end up with the first instance where it becomes established that beings of this nature come to be translated into English as fairies, even though the cultural distance might be quite significant. So yeah, that's the basic story of where fairy comes from.
Last time, I think either you were here or done a different interview, you had said that to understand modern fairies, we shouldn't look to Celtic people or French people, but instead to the Romans. So, how far back, in your estimation, when is the first fairy being appearing in a folkloric record?
Oh, yeah, it's a really difficult question. I mean, we get references in penitentials, early kind of handbooks instructing priests on what people should not be believing, to people who believe that they are visited by the fates, that they are visited by three women who can be placated to sort of give good fates, if you like, by laying a table for them, putting out little knives for them, and essentially kind of offering a ritual meal to these women. And you find that sort of in the ninth, 10th centuries in penitentials like that of Burkhard of Worms. And so that's sort of the Rhineland area. I think that's perhaps the first reference that we have to something we might recognize as a fairy. But it's difficult to say. I mean, some people think that fairies are these kind of degenerated gods and goddesses that originally they were pagan gods and goddesses, and they've just dwindled and become ever more insignificant. I don't take that view. I tend to think that godlings, so minor gods and goddesses of nature, are a feature, not a bug. They are something which is always there in pre-Christian religiosity. So you've got, for example, the fauns and satyrs and nymphs in ancient belief, the lares and penates, the genii cucullati in Britain, for example. And I would say these beings are essentially fairies. They are functionally fairies. However, is there a direct connection between them and the fairies that we come across in medieval sources? That's the $1 million question. And it's the $1 million question that Twilight of the Godlings tries to answer. And in the end, I have to give up and admit that I do not know. I can't give a definitive answer.
Oh, in this book, you said there are reasons to take seriously the idea of fairy belief as a manifestation of animism, which I kind of agree with you
Yeah.
on, because again, if you think of yokai in Japan, that's very true. Although it is also far from clear that that this really explains where fairies come from. But if it is true that fairies emerge from animism, the implications are profound. It would mean that fairies may be, at least among European and people of European heritage, the oldest surviving of all popular beliefs.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I I'm in two minds about this idea. I think that there are good reasons to think that fairies could be a manifestation of an animist impulse within human beings, and this is more of an anthropological rather than a historical point. But when we look at the way in which children tend to imbue the world around them with personality and objects with personality, or indeed if we look at the way in which people in some indigenous societies will treat the entire nature surrounding them as a relationship with persons. Graham Harvey has written quite persuasively about this, that animism is not a belief, it's a relationship. It's a relationship with other beings around you as persons. That this is perhaps the first form of proto-religiosity, because I don't think it can be called religiosity, but the first form of human proto-religiosity that perhaps persisted for tens of thousands of years before anything like what we might consider to be religiosity arrived. And we have no way of knowing whether that really is true. But if it is true, then yeah, fairies could be the very oldest of all our belief systems, the last remnants of that earliest belief system, where we effectively engage with the world around us as personification. So, features of the natural world manifest themselves to us as beings that reflect humanity but aren't human, but are communicating with us. So, like the idea that a tree might manifest as a human-like being which seeks to communicate with us, or even a forest might manifest as a human-like being that tries to communicate with us. You find this in Estonian belief, which has deep roots in Finno-Ugric animism, for example. So yeah, that's one theory, and I don't want to go too far in one direction because I think you start ending up getting a bit reductionist, and I hate being reductionist. I don't want to give a sort of one size fits all explanation for fairies. That is the absolute last thing that I would want to do. I'm not that kind of historian. But I do think that it does offer a persuasive way at looking at the persistence of this idea. But I don't want that to erase the diversity of, cultural interpretations of fairies to say, oh, we've explained it now. It's all just, animist beings, animist relationships with beings that have survived under Christianity and under other religious beliefs. I don't want to erase that diversity. So in the book, I devote a chapter to looking at this idea of prehistoric nature spirits as one stream which has which has contributed to the river that is fairy lore. But I do not think it's reductive. It's not the only thing. And the other major stream that we haven't mentioned yet that contributes to fairy lore is, of course, the Bible and extra biblical kind of apocryphal writings that have a huge influence on medieval perceptions of the supernatural world and allow them to kind of accommodate and contemplate the possibility of fairies.
So when it comes to fairies and magic, have fairies always been invisible? Have they always been associated with magic? Because again, especially in the biblical context, it seems like everybody's fine with fairies having magic and magic exists. But where did they get that? Is it again Roman that they get that magical aspect? And when did they get mixed up with things like witchcraft?
Yeah, I think that there will always be a connection between these lower godlings and magic because magic is a fairly earthy, a fairly kind of marginalized practice. It's something which people who don't have a lot of power will typically engage in. Not always, in another of my books, I wrote about how people with a lot of power would also sometimes make use of magic. But, typically it's a refuge of the disempowered. And so are godlings because, they are the ones you approach because you're not, of a level or you don't have the sacrifices or you don't have the priests or whatever to approach the higher deities of your religion. but you can make some sort of bargain with these lower level nature spirits. And so I think that's perhaps the reason why there's a connection. But I think the other major reason is because of the relationship between fairies and fate or destiny. And that's something which is embedded in that word fairy, but we also find it in other traditions totally independently without that word, being used for fairies. Nevertheless, that idea that somehow the fairies have a greater knowledge of our destiny and our mortality than we do, that they have a different relationship with time compared to us. They know things about us that we don't. And of course, if you can gain some kind of control over fate, over destiny, that surely is the ultimate magic, that you can change the course of events, that you can alter that which is, foreshadowed, or that which is, preordained. So yeah, that connection with destiny, with divination, with fate, that also is a reason why there's always a connection with magic. But having said that, the idea of directly conjuring fairies and using them in magic, so ordering up a fairy to do your will as a magician, that's a very late idea. That does not arrive until the very end of the Middle Ages, so sort of late 15th century, we start to get that idea.
So where did this idea that fairies are smaller than humans come from? And when did they get their wings?
Yeah, the idea of fairies being diminutive is pretty old. I mean, you can find it even in certain beings in the ancient world. You've got godlings like the attendants of Cupid, who are very small. You've got godlings like Psyche, who's often portrayed as very small, and with butterfly wings, because she is kind of personified as the butterfly. Yeah, and the Geni Cucullati from from Britain, who were very, very short as well. So the idea of diminutive beings, it's not exclusively a later development. It's something we find earlier on too, but it's not universal. So we find, for example, some early medieval accounts, like the idea of the Portunes, which comes from Gervase of Tilbury. He talks about these beings who are tiny and they eat frogs and they live in people's houses and warm themselves by the fire. And so they're this sort of diminutive house spirit. But then a lot of encounters with fairies in the Middle Ages they're just normal sized, human sized beings, even though they're not human. Like Morgan Le Fay, for example, she's looks like a normal human lady, even though she's very beautiful. So yeah, it's not really until Shakespeare that you get the idea that fairies in general could be considered to be small. You get that in to some extent in the Midsummer Night's Dream, but also in the Merry Wives of Windsor, where there's a fairy play and the fairies are played by children because fairies are supposed to be small. And then we get this idea in Alexander Pope in The Rape of the Lock in the 18th century. And then by the time we're in the 19th century, it's quite popular, the fairy theme of being sort of small and insect-like. And I think the first reference to fairies being so small that they have insect wings is from Scotland in the 15th century in a literary context. So yeah, it's a gradual development, and some places it's never had any influence whatsoever. So in Ireland, the idea that fairies have wings doesn't exist; it's just not a thing. And similarly, the ice she, properly speaking, are human sized or even taller than human sized, whereas it's the leprechauns and this specific category of dwarf fairies, if you like, who are considered diminutive. And even then, those fairies are not that diminutive. They're sort of 3 or 4 feet tall. They're not miniature. They're just short. And so, yeah, it's in some cultures it's had no influence at all, like Iceland. So the Icelandic elves, they're just the same size as a normal person. There's no sense in which they're shorter or smaller. So yeah, I mean, well, in terms of theories, one theory which has been proposed by the Estonian scholar Lennart Mari, he said the reason why gnomes, dwarves, fairies, and so forth, these supernatural beings, are short is because originally they were thought to live very far away. But of course, the further you look into the horizon, the closer the horizon comes to the ground, and therefore only very small beings could fit at the edge of the map. And therefore there are pygmies at the edge of the map. It's an interesting theory. I'm not sure I buy it 100%. But another theory is to do with fairy rings. So if you look
Mm.
at your average fairy ring, where the fungal mycelium has created this kind of ring of very lush grass, from the late Middle Ages they come to be associated with fairies, or at least that's the earliest record we have. If there are beings dancing in a ring to make those circles, they must be pretty small. So perhaps that's where it comes from. Or the idea of domestic fairies. So if there are domestic fairies that are hiding in your house, then your house probably isn't very big if you're an ordinary person. So it must be that those domestic fairies are also very small and live under the floorboards, for example, or in cupboards. So there's, various possibilities, but none of them really add up. And the only thing I would say that I think we can say with certainty is that it could be a shorthand for non-humanness. Equally, gigantism is a shorthand for non-humanness. But when we get into the Christian tradition, giants have a slightly different connotation because of the book of Genesis. So it's a way of saying like humans, but not really human. So yeah, it's a sort of shorthand in the same way, really, that wingedness is a shorthand for fairies now. It's like, well, why do they have to have wings? There's no reason why they have wings other than to just give us this visual clue to say, oh, not quite human, something different, a kind of spirit being. Therefore, it has this sort of strange characteristic, uncanny characteristic.
Well, as a short person, I have to say, I find it interesting that it's a shorthand for otherworldliness. I don't know if being 5 feet tall qualifies. Maybe I'm too big for a fairy. So where exactly do the fairies live? Where is fairyland? Is it in the water? Is it under the ground?
Yeah, this is something where there's a great deal of diversity across Europe. So, where there might be unanimity on things like, invisibility or enchantment or changeling law, for example, we find that all over the place. The location of Elfheim or Fairyland or the place of enchantment where fairies dwell differs quite significantly. The typical view that we have of this is essentially British. I say British because both English and Welsh and Scottish elements feed into this. But it's the idea that if you go inside a hill or a tumulus, perhaps some kind of prehistoric grave mound, you will encounter a gateway to a land where time moves slightly differently. It is ruled over by a king and queen, usually. The people there might be diminutive, they might not be. Usually they're beautiful rather than ugly, although they might alternate between beauty and ugliness, or some of them might be ugly, sort of capturing that sense of ambiguity. And it is a place that exists in a rather complex relationship with hell, in that it's not hell. It's not a place of horror and punishment and eternal fire and torment or anything like that. But you get in a lot of British traditions the idea that the fairies must pay a tithe to hell. So they kind of have a relationship with the devil, that they are not part of his kingdom, that they are feudally subject to him. So they sort of have to pay a kind of feudal fee, if you like, to retain their independence from hell. And there are certain things that mortals must never do in fairyland. The principal one being eat anything. You must not eat anything if you enter into fairyland. Now, in Ireland, the traditions are often very similar to that. However, in the oldest Irish traditions, there are multiple different fairylands. So each burial mound, which the word she actually means burial mound in Irish, under each one, there's its own fairyland, and they're not connected. So there's like a place where the she of that area gather and feast, but it's not connected to the others, and there isn't any kind of sense of a single king or queen of the fairies or anything. And indeed, the idea of a queen of the fairies that seems to come from Scotland, and the idea of a king of the fairies, that seems to come out of Welsh tradition. So there's lots of things feeding in there. But go somewhere else, like Lithuania or Ukraine, for example, there you will find that fairyland is effectively the forest. So, because the forest is a place of mystery and a place of threat, the fairies, who are all female in the Slavic and Baltic tradition, they live inside the forest. Or indeed, in a lot of the Irish traditions, fairies live underwater.
Hmm.
And when I say underwater, I don't mean they're actually aquatic beings. I mean that underneath the surface of a loch, there is a world which is not flooded, but is a separate world separated by water as a sort of liminal space that cuts off that world from our world. So again, I think it's not so much that fairyland has to take one particular form, but we can say that fairyland is separated from our world by something that we find a bit uncanny. So, big lakes with enormous kind of surface areas. You don't know how deep it is. You don't know what's down there. That's an uncanny place. Old burial mounds and tumuluses and hills that are sort of uncanny points in the landscape, likewise. Or, of course, in the Eastern European tradition, the forest as the home of fairies. So yeah, they seem to dwell in these kind of places that we as humans find a little bit unsettling. Or in the Icelandic tradition, inside unusual rock formations.
So we touched a little bit on monsters. And how exactly do monsters connect to fairies? And really, what's the difference?
Yeah, there's a whole chapter of the book on fairies about monstrosity, because it's a huge theme, especially in the 12th century in Christian writing about the natural world, sort of proto-science, I suppose you could call it, where theologians are very interested in the idea of monsters. I mean, it goes all the way back to St. Augustine. It's not
Hmm.
exclusively confined to the 12th century, but that's the period when people like Albert the Great, for example, become very interested in the possibility of monsters at the edge of the map. So people living in very, very far-flung parts of the globe who may or may not be people. So the idea of the dog heads, people with normal human bodies but the head of a dog, or people with faces in the middle of their chests and no heads, the acephaly, and pygmies as well, these kind of unusually short beings, or giants as well. So this whole kind of gamut of beings which partly are drawn from classical mythology, partly drawn from, the speculations of ancient philosophers, but they are kind of supercharged by this question as the church expands its reach. Will we encounter beings whose humanity is ambivalent? What do we do? Do we baptize them? Do we try to convert them to the Christian faith? What's their status within the economy of salvation? And this is endlessly debated. But you also, of course, have monsters within your midst. So, reports of women who have given birth to these strange creatures, which are often reported on with great wonder. And Augustine is very interested in these, and wonders why God would permit this. And I would say that there is a strong connection between fairy lore and the monstrous tradition, because it's essentially taking these beings who are, in the learned tradition on the edge of the map, but putting them closer to us and putting them right up against us, and suggesting that, there may be these kind of ambivalent populations of non-human beings. And you find this also in the church fathers, that sometimes they will report that, a faun was encountered or a centaur was encountered, treating these as completely real beings, but then raising that question of, well, are they human or are they not? These kind of human animal hybrid creatures like centaurs and fauns. And yeah, it's a troubling question. But at the same time, it is a question that's good to think with, because it allows you to then puzzle out what is the true nature of salvation, what is the true reach of the Christian message. So it serves a kind of a philosophical and a theological purpose.
Speaking of the theological purpose, we're talking about fairy belief. And it's the collapse of fairy belief alienates us from fundamental aspects of our ancestors' perception of reality. There are still places in the world where there is fairy belief, places like Ireland and Iceland. Why do you think that fairy belief rose and declined? Do you think there's a resurgence of fairy belief, or do you think it's changed somewhat?
I think there is a resurgence, but I think that there is a big change because in contemporary Britain and North America, most people who believe in fairies have made a conscious choice to do so. So it's almost as though you're choosing to believe in fairies rather in the same way that you might choose to join a confession, to become a Mormon or to become a Christian or whatever. It's sort of it's it's an it's a countercultural choice that you are making to believe in something. Now, as far as I'm concerned, that is just as worthy of respect as people who convert to a religion. I don't see why we should say that, believing in fairies or believing in various kinds of folk beliefs is somehow lesser than, a choice that somebody has made to live according to the precepts of a religion. We have this arbitrary distinction that we make between giving respect to religions and not giving respect to other forms of supernatural belief. So I would very much say that those people are worthy of respect. In some cases, they have chosen to believe in fairies because they have had encounters. And this is something which is a constant. People are always having encounters with fairies, and I've done my best in the book to document these, or document at least the kind of the pattern of these encounters over the ages. And I think that there is a renewed interest in these encounters when you look at something like the Modern Fairy Sightings podcast, for example, which is very, very popular. You've got books but about meeting fairies. Some of them, from a sort of theosophical or clairvoyant perspective. Some of them from a more folkloric perspective. But there seems to be a deep interest in this, and a tourist interest as well. So people will go to Ireland and they go to Iceland in the hope of seeing fairies. And sometimes that's a bit of a joke, but sometimes it's quite seriously meant. And I think because there's been a sort of collapse in traditional religion, for a lot of people, the idea of giving meaning to your life through engaging with folk traditions has to some extent filled that space that's been vacated by traditional religions within people's cultures. And in some cases, it's never left. So, as you mentioned, there are countries that retain a pretty strong fairy belief. I think it can sometimes be exaggerated for touristic effect. People sometimes exaggerate how many Irish people or Icelandic people actually believe in fairies and elves. But again, traditional fairy belief isn't really belief, it's interaction.
Hmm.
Traditional fairy interaction or fairy lore is based on fear and avoidance. And the typical example of that would be the fairy tree in Ireland, which cannot be felled, and the road has to be directed around it. You still get stories like that
Hmm.
where, fairy trees must not be interfered with. Do all those people involved in those construction projects believe in fairies? Absolutely not. But they are not willing to take the risk of doing something which is a cultural taboo. And that is traditional fairy belief. So I would distinguish that sort of traditional surviving fairy belief from the sort of modern fairy belief that is a conscious decision to opt in to saying, oh, I'm going to go into my garden and try and make contact with fairies today. That's a different kind of thing. And it has its roots in 19th and 20th century theosophy, in sort of spiritualist practices of trying to make contact with the spirit world and so forth. In traditional fairy belief, you never want to make contact with the fairies.
Yeah.
Absolutely not. You want the least possible to do with the fairies. The only time you're going to do anything is because you're going to placate them to avoid incurring their wrath because you've done something like, plowed within a fairy fort on your farm in Ireland or in Iceland, where you've cut across an elf path, for example, and violated the territory of the elves. So yeah, I think there is a huge difference between traditional fairy belief that does survive in a few places and this sort of modern opt-in kind of fairy belief.
How do fairies exist outside the world of religion, really? Because you said that fairies are, in other words, beings of folklore that stand out outside the official Christian cosmology. It is true, but I mean, even in Judaism, Judaism has a long history of we wouldn't call them fairies, but things like the Shadim and other beings. I always say like other beings that have long existed, or the Nephilim, things like that, that constantly exist. And so I think it's interesting that in as you said previously, that in olden Christian traditions, everybody was fine with fairies, and even that fairies had their own sort of churches in one aspect, which I think is hilarious. It's great. But today it seems to be, I don't know what it is. I don't know whether it's the association with certain nouveau crowds, but today there seems to be this distinction of no, fairies are not allowed to exist within the traditional realm.
Yes, when you go back to medieval Christianity, you will not encounter very many instances of preachers who say, stop believing this nonsense, fairies don't exist. They will say, stop doing this nonsense, stop interacting with fairies because they are demonic illusions. But the question is not, do they exist? The question is, what are they? Are they good? Are they bad? Are they something in between? And different theologians, different preachers give different answers to that question. It's really, therefore, the Enlightenment that introduces that possibility that fairies might not exist at all. And so there's a chapter of the book which is devoted to the Enlightenment. But tellingly, that chapter is divided into two halves because I look at the argument that fairies did not exist at all, but I also look at an almost equal number of people in the Enlightenment who are quite certain that they did.